It was the experience of a lifetime. Never again can it be repeated exactly, and never will it be forgotten. My name is Nick, and I'm about to give you my account of my incredible adventure through Salzburg and Vienna, Austria, two of the most musical cities in the world, during the spring of 2009, my junior year as an undergrad. Our journey begins at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where I currently major in music composition. UNCG is known for its outstanding music program and is one of the top public music institutions in the United States. Dr. David Nelson is a professor of music at UNCG and served as the trip's tour guide. He was certainly well qualified for the job. Dr. Nelson has published a book on the musical sights of Vienna, and in 2008 received the Golden Medal of Honor from the Chief Executive Officer of Vienna. That's the second highest honor that Vienna has ever given to an American. On the morning of Friday, March 7th, we said goodbye to our friends and loved ones and hopped the plane for Salzburg. Our flight path included stops in Detroit, Amsterdam, and Munich. Here's me with Jim, my roommate for the trip. Jim is an oboist and was already a friend of mine. There's Lita, a nutrition major, on the left, and Tiffany, a music education major, on the right. There's Austin, a horn player, playing with his camera as we waited for the plane to arrive. We stopped first at the Detroit airport. We were able to grab some food at a Chili's in the airport. There's me discussing something musical with Joseph, a music education major. And check out this nifty, musical, colorful tunnel we had to walk through in the airport. I'll let Tiffany describe it a little better.
We're here in Detroit, and apparently when you get off and we're trying to get to like the A section, there's like this crazy light show with weird creepy music going on as we're walking. Okay, gotta catch up back to the group. Bye.
Soon we were back on the plane. There's Alan, a broadcasting and cinema major. And there's Josh, the graduate assistant for the trip. That's Katie, a vocalist, on the right, somewhere in the Amsterdam airport, which was our second stop. Finally, we landed in Munich at about 8:45 a.m. their time and hopped a small but very comfortable bus to Salzburg. By this time, we were all completely wiped out, having gotten little to no sleep on the plane. Out the window, a light snow was falling, and I barely held my eyes open as I caught view of the gigantic Swiss Alps. But Dr. Nelson perked us up when he gave us each some real Austrian chocolate bars. We arrived, groggy but quite excited, in beautiful Salzburg. We immediately walked to our hotel. Our hotel, the Hotel Weiße Taube, which means the White Dove, was like all of Salzburg, quaint, cozy, clean, and picturesque. The hallways were narrow, in a fashion quite similar to the cobblestone streets of the city. There's Jim modeling with the beds in our hotel room. We spent a mere 10 minutes in the hotel before heading out to lunch at the Gablerbräu. The food was good, and the environment was warm and inviting, with a gorgeous stained glass display separating part of the restaurant. There's Ben to the far left. He's also a music education major. That's Cheryl in between Tiffany and Alan. Cheryl is not a student, but wanted to take the trip, and she quickly became our friend. Alan was enjoying one of the fine Austrian beers that most of us would greatly enjoy throughout the trip. Following lunch, we began a walking tour of the city, led by Brigitte Sebald. Brigitte was very knowledgeable, clear, and intelligent. In fact, all the tour guides on the trip were excellent and also spoke English very well. I wish I could exactly retell the marvelous history of the city in her words, but for now, you'll just have to believe me that she was a great guide and gave us a tremendous amount of information in a very short time. Oh, and one quick note. I'm easily identifiable throughout many of these photos by my bright red toboggan. The streets of Salzburg were as picturesque as Salzburg's surrounding landscape. The buildings of the central Salzburg area were all adjoined and very tall. Everywhere we went was clean and well kept. We passed Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's birth house, though we couldn't enter due to renovation. We passed a restaurant that dated back to the year 803. The Salzach River runs through the city. This river connects Austria to Germany. We started off our walking tour with a trip to the local music university. A very modern building, the university features state-of-the-art practice rooms with glass walls so that others can see in while students practice. This was unlike anything I'd seen before, but Brigitte figured that it probably encouraged the students to stay focused on their practice. The Mirabelle Gardens were impressive, but we were told they would be even more impressive if we came back in the summertime. Here's the group in the gardens, at one of the sites where The Sound of Music was actually filmed, but there'll be more on that later. Before we could continue too much longer, Brigitte recommended we stop for hot chocolate in a classy restaurant so that we could warm up from the bitter cold. The restaurant had a cave-like atmosphere with a large wing upstairs that featured a large ballroom and contained a harpsichord and piano. We took time to admire the artwork and architecture and play a little on the pianos. We took an extensive tour of the St. Peter's Cemetery, which was unlike any cemetery I'd ever seen before. Each grave was carefully adorned with flowers, and each was enclosed in its own room-like space to keep it protected from people or weather. From the ground, the fortress towered above us regally. Out on the streets were interesting sights as well. A giant golden ball with a man on top served as a center point. Adjacent sat a street-sized chessboard. Gorgeous equestrian statues were everywhere to be seen, as well as a statue of Mozart. The final part of the tour was a trip to the beautiful Salzburg Cathedral. It was magnificent in size and beauty. Brigitte encouraged us to sing while inside in order to hear the reverb. It was an excellent conclusion to the walking tour of Salzburg. We had dinner as a group at the Sternbrau, where many of us had our first taste of a famous Austrian wheat beer known as Edelweiss, which was very popular with the group. The food was good, once again, and best of all, Dr. Nelson treated the group to a soufflé. It's apparent Katie was especially excited about it. Outside sat a Red Bull statue, famous throughout the city as it's their hockey and soccer team mascot. The second day of our visit to Salzburg started off great. We rose early for a fantastic sit-down breakfast at our hotel. The typical Austrian breakfast we experienced in both Salzburg and Vienna included a famous Austrian coffee, fresh-baked bread, a plate of cold cuts, yogurt, and a soft-boiled egg, or some variant thereof. Following breakfast, the majority of the group traveled to see the fortress. To reach the fortress, visitors can ride in a little cable car up to the top, which was a lot of fun in itself. The views from the top of the Salzburg fortress were breathtaking, to say the least. The majestic snow-covered Swiss Alps provide a backdrop to the town and countryside below. Unfortunately, no photo really captures this experience, but fortunately, some of my fellow travelers did take some great pictures. Here's a shot of everyone that went with me to the top, minus Dr. Nelson, who took the picture. Inside the fortress walls, I felt as if I'd been transported to another time and place. The fortress almost felt like its own separate little town. Here's Lita hugging a gnarly old tree inside the fortress walls. These days, inside the actual fortress was a full-scale museum. Inside included rooms made to look original, including kitchen areas, bedrooms, rooms for entertainment, and naturally a chapel. There's Jim demonstrating how short the doors could be, though Jim is pretty tall. It featured a wide variety of period weapons, including several cannons. Here's Lita about to demonstrate one of them on my face. You could look out the windows and see the city below. The museum also featured a small collection of ancient musical instruments, and prominently featured a collection of marionette puppets. The marionette theater is and has been an important staple of Salzburg culture. You may remember the marionettes from The Sound of Music. The puppets could actually be pretty creepy. Check out this animatronic one who is climbing up to us from the dungeon beneath. We met for lunch at Il Centro Pizzeria after our trip to the fortress. They had good pizza, but I partook in a mushroom Alfredo pasta, which I found to be excellent. It's not a meal in Austria without a delicious sweet treat afterwards, so a few of us split a chocolate crepe. The next part of the trip was perhaps one of the most memorable from Salzburg. I, along with Jim, Lita, Cheryl, and Tiffany, decided to take one of the famous Sound of Music tours offered in Salzburg. We decided on Bob's Special Tours, and we were picked up in a small passenger van by our tour guide around 2 p.m. It was just my group and our tour guide, so we had our own private tour. Unfortunately, we never got a picture of our tour guide, Rosa Maria. Rosa Maria was very personable and very knowledgeable. We started off our trip with a visit to the Von Trapp home. See the lake behind us? It's frozen. Rosa Maria filled us in with all kinds of fun facts and inaccuracies in the movie, but I won't spoil them here. You might recognize this image from where Maria is singing "I Have Confidence" in The Sound of Music. And you probably recognize this as the very gazebo in which "I Am 16 Going on 17" is performed. You may notice that it's glassed in, however. The glass was put in place as a protective measure, as people have hurt themselves by jumping bench to bench over time. Next, Rosa Maria drove us about 30 minutes out of town to the town of Monsi. On the way were gorgeous snow-covered homes and countryside. We occasionally passed an interesting bit of modern architecture, but mostly storybook-like homes. At one point, we all stopped for one of the most incredible views I've ever witnessed. These pictures barely capture the beauty of these views, and it was truly a spiritual experience for me. We stopped in a small restaurant for coffee and famous Austrian apple strudel. The restaurant served us a glass of water with our coffee, which in Austria is indicative of a good coffee shop. After coffee, we walked over to the chapel in which Maria wed the Captain Von Trapp. Once again, the chapel was incredibly ornate and obviously well maintained. Of course, it was a major tourist attraction. But like so many other buildings in Austria, the chapel was not simply garnished with excellent artwork, it was a piece of excellent artwork. It was sad to see the end of our tour and part with Rosa Maria. We made one final stop at the famous fountain in Mirabel Gardens. The children and Maria sing Do Re Mi here in the movie. Dinner that night was at a nice restaurant with a neighborhood kind of feel. The food was good, but we saved room for a trip to the Augustiner Keller that was to follow. The Augustiner Keller Beer Hall was a rustic, lively place, and is famous for its beer brewed exclusively by monks. High schoolers and old-timers alike gathered here to enjoy the beer. We were able to choose from 2 beers, one darker than the other. I picked the darker one. The beer, of course, was delicious, and certainly greatly enjoyed by most, and I was impressed with everyone's moderation as well. Perhaps best of all, many of us purchased a tall beer mug identical to the ones from which we drank for a relatively low price. After the Augustiner, we enjoyed a peaceful walk back to the hotel, admiring the town, which was as beautiful at night as in the day. Here's Katie and me posing while standing on the historic Mozart bridge. Here's a closer shot at the amazingly illuminated city and Salzburg River. The next morning we were up bright and early and we boarded a train for Vienna. It was a brief but packed couple of days in Salzburg, and it was hard to part with it. The train ride was smooth and comfortable. We amused ourselves talking, viewing scenery, listening to music, and some of us even practicing our instruments. We took taxis from the train station to arrive at the Hotel Kolping. The hotel in Vienna was modern rather than quaint, but quite comfortable and offered a great buffet breakfast each morning. Directly across from the hotel stood the Schnitzel King, an Austrian fast food restaurant. I never made it in there, but it was good fodder for laughs. We hopped Vienna's incredibly fast, clean, and efficient subway system to the center of town, where we were greeted by our tour guide, Marietta Rain. Central Vienna was a contrast in many ways to Salzburg. It was much more spacious, with many magnificent large buildings surrounding us. There were large cobblestone streets, with shops and many other establishments, including American franchises. Horse-drawn carriages were to be found everywhere. We met Marietta near the Hofburg Royal Palace. It was here that Adolf Hitler delivered a speech in March of 1938, announcing the unification of Austria with Germany. Pretty heavy stuff. The thing was, though, most buildings, including museums and universities, looked like palaces in Vienna. Even the city hall, known as the Rathaus, looks grand. We'll take a closer look at it later. Near the center of the square was a display of ancient Viennese ruins. Before continuing, and to warm us up from the bitter cold, we gathered into the Julius Meinl Cafe for some excellent coffee. In Austria, to order simply coffee with milk, you would order a browner. We were served a complimentary piece of fudge with our purchase. For the final part of our tour, we visited the grandest of all the Viennese structures, the glorious St. Stephen's Cathedral. A tall glass building stands next to the cathedral, creating a reflection that creates the effect of another connected tower. Inside, the cathedral was fully explorable. As with the other cathedrals we saw, it housed a massive pipe organ and an amazing collection of artwork and architecture. A magnificent rosary stained glass window drew attention to the center of the cathedral. When the tour concluded, we said goodbye to our new friend Marietta, and we decided to tour the catacombs beneath. Unfortunately, there was no photography permitted in the catacombs, though here's one glimpse of the beginning of the tour. Our tour guide was completely fluent in English and German and would switch seamlessly between both languages. He also had a great sense of humor. We had some free time to explore the magnificent streets of Vienna. We passed street performers like this man with a rare and expensive drum called a hong drum. Dinner was at a place called Breitzel with a great atmosphere. Located deep underground, it felt much like a cave, but with a cozy, homey feel. And of course, Vienna's world-famous Wiener Schnitzel was excellent. Here's me with Alan creating a W for Wien, which is the Austrian word for Vienna. Following dinner, several of us joined Dr. Nelson for a night walk of Vienna. The city remains artistically lit throughout the night. The Hofburg Palace, the Rathaus, and even the streets were beautifully illuminated, creating a sort of luminary feast for the eyes. Our first full day in Vienna began with a visit to the Vienna State Opera House. That's it right behind us here. On the street, you can see the electric bus lines that run throughout the city. While we didn't see an actual opera here, we did get a full backstage tour. Once again, our tour guide really knew his stuff. We started out seeing side rooms filled with modern art, and even ballrooms where special events take place. Again, the architecture was superb in every room. We toured rooms for special VIP events. And we got a full view backstage as the set for the night's performances were being assembled. Finally, we entered the main room, where we could sit in the chairs and stare up at the grandness of its construction. After a stop at the gift shop, it was on to the Mozart House Vienna, which was one of Mozart's apartments. There were unfortunately not pictures taken inside, but here's my ticket stub. Lunch was at the Rosenberger, a large buffet-style cafeteria. It had a huge variety of food choices, and I tried some goulash. Following lunch, a large group of us visited an apartment of composer Joseph Haydn. Here's some of the fellows hanging out in the apartment's courtyard. Haydn's apartment was laid out in a typical Viennese style. It included a Haydn bust, his death mask, and several of his original manuscripts. On one of the walls hung a large portrait of Johannes Brahms. On the way back to the hotel, we passed a great statue of Mozart. That night was one of the highest anticipated of all of the trip for me. Finally, we would hear live music. We attended the concert at the Musikverein to hear the Tchaikovsky Symphony Orchestra Moscow. The Musikverein was beyond jaw-dropping, with its gold-plated walls and ceilings and massive chandeliers. These pictures can't come close to capturing the real vibrancy of the color, and the recordings of this music can't come close to duplicating the crisp, rich tones heard that night. The orchestra I found beyond amazing. Words can't describe how moving, expressive, and purely exciting this music was. Chills ran down my spine repeatedly, and it was truly a powerful experience. Following the concert was a visit to the world-famous Hotel Soccer for some of Austria's fine Soccer Torte, a chocolate cake with a thin layer of apricot jam inside. It wasn't overly sweet, which in my opinion quickly made it superior to many desserts I've tried before. Naturally, it was elegantly presented as well. Our fifth day of the trip was off to a great start, with a visit to the collection of ancient musical instruments. Once again, the museum was housed in a magnificent and ornate structure. Our tour was led by the knowledgeable Dr. Rudolf Hopfner and featured an amazing assortment of different instruments. Some of my personal favorites included the organs, the keyboard that slid out from a table, the combination keyboard and walking sticks, and this 1950s style piano. Another highlight included a brief performance by yours truly of a Bach prelude on a keyboard most probably played by Mozart himself. Following our museum tour was a visit to the Haus der Musik. There weren't many photos taken here, but this museum focused on the scientific aspects of music. There were lots of computer terminals and even an area where you could conduct a virtual orchestra. Here's Lita and Jim posing with some of the mannequins in the museum. We followed up the Haus der Musik with a visit to the beautiful Imperial Library. The ceilings were incredibly high and painted beautifully. The multi-story bookshelves seemed to climb up for ages. That night was a highly anticipated trip to see Johann Strauss's famous operetta Die Fledermaus. An operetta is a light and usually funny opera, and Die Fledermaus, which means the bat, was just that. We saw it at the Volksoper, which means Folks Theater, not to be confused with the opera house we saw earlier. The group had studied the operetta thoroughly before making the trip, so we could all follow along with no trouble. Plus, there were English subtitles on a screen to follow along. The music and performances were both excellent, and this was certainly a highlight of the trip for me. The sixth day of the trip started off with almost everything Beethoven. Our first stop was to Heiligenstadt. Heiligenstadt has real musical and historical significance. When Beethoven was first struggling with his encroaching deafness, he sought the help of his doctor, who recommended that Beethoven locate here, away from the noise of the city. It was on these very streets that Beethoven realized the totality of his deafness. Along this picturesque stream, Beethoven once walked for inspiration for his Sixth Symphony. And we walked where he walked. We made many stops as we explored Heiligenstadt. One such stop, a visit to the popular Beethoven statue. Here's me doing my impersonation. Not bad, I thought. Though we all had a lot of fun hanging out with Beethoven. There was a visit to the Heiligenstadt Museum, which inhabited an apartment that was probably once inhabited by Beethoven himself. Behind me here is an actual lock of Beethoven's hair. Pretty cool. We stopped for a group lunch in the same neighborhood at a place called Idelio. We once again had great food and good conversation. Here's what I had, the Austrian idea of chicken salad. It was chicken on top of a salad, but it was good nevertheless. Our afternoon was free, so Jim, Cheryl, Lita, and I took a trip to the famous Riesenrad, a huge Ferris wheel that can be seen in films like The Third Man. Naturally, there were some pretty amazing views of the city, though the ride didn't last quite long enough, in my opinion. Afterwards, we stopped in at the gift shop. That night was another fantastic night of music. This time, we attended the Vienna Symphony Orchestra's performance of Stravinsky's Agon, his Capriccio for piano and orchestra, and two works by Haydn, a piano concerto and his 88th Symphony. This concert was at the Vienna Concert House, so we dressed to impress. Once again, the hall was magnificent, as were the musical performances. I was personally wowed by the orchestra's pianist. On Friday morning, we traveled to Vienna's Central Cemetery by electric bus. Before we entered the cemetery, we each bought some flowers to place on the graves. And what an amazing assortment of graves there were. Viewing the graveyard was a truly spiritual, almost unreal experience. We stood over the very place that Beethoven rested. As an aspiring composer, I was greatly impacted by that realization. But the graveyard housed the graves of many other great composers, including, but certainly not limited to, Johann Strauss, Johannes Brahms, even Arnold Schoenberg. Before heading on, we stopped for a visit to the Vienna St. Mark Cemetery to view a memorial for Mozart. Historians estimate Mozart's actual grave to be within about 30 feet of this spot. We had more free time that afternoon, so Jim and Lita and I grabbed some famous Vienna sausage for lunch before visiting the Vienna Art Museum. Housed in yet another fantastical structure, the art museum featured Greco-Roman and Egyptian works, as well as paintings by many famous artists. Some of my personal favorites included the Rembrandt exhibit and the works by Diego Velázquez. We stopped for a break at the little art museum cafe, which was located in the perfect center of the large rotunda. Once again, we enjoyed some fine apple strudel and hot coffee. After the museum, we began a great night. Remember the Rathaus from earlier? That's the Vienna City Hall. Dr. Nelson's friend Bettina is a head city officer and gave us our own private tour. This place was not your ordinary American city hall. Once again, gorgeous architecture came standard. We toured a room featuring the portraits of all the former mayors. Check out these huge rooms. At the time of our visit, a party in honor of the city police was about to begin. We stopped in to see where official government business was conducted. We were all temporarily assigned roles as government officials. I think I might have been a vice chancellor if I remember correctly. Immediately following the tour, we were honored as guests of the city of Vienna with a trip to the vineyards. We were given a full tour of the vineyard, and then participated in a wine tasting. Following the wine tasting was an excellent buffet dinner, and of course free wine, which was a big hit with the travelers. It was an excellent night of conversation and food, and Bettina was the kindest and most wonderful of hosts. Saturday was sadly our last full day in Vienna, and we had free time all day. Jim and I finally got a little sleep in, and then set off to explore the Naschmarkt, which is a large outdoor food and clothes market. Jim and I joined some of our fellow travelers at the Café Sperl. Next, we traveled to the famous Belvedere. The Belvedere is another famous art museum. It featured a great view from the front with spacious gardens and courtyards. I'm very sad to say, however, that there was no indoor photography allowed. Inside, I was able to see Gustav Klimt's famous The Kiss. It was incredibly beautiful, and there's no comparison to the photographed versions of the work. The gold-colored background you see here was real gold inlay, and I stared in amazement for several minutes straight. I also managed to see the famous Napoleon Crossing the Alps by Jacques-Louis David, which stretched out across an entire wall. Our last concert was that night at the Musikverein again, and was a full night of Haydn, including his 95th Symphony and his Mass in Time of War. It featured a full orchestra and choir, and was a great musical conclusion to the trip. I emerged from this trip feeling transformed, enlightened, and even a little less scared of being out of my comfort zone. This video scrapbook couldn't possibly substitute the feeling and the experience of being in these amazing cities, but I hope it at least gave you a taste of the Austrian way of life. This trip changed my life, and I will never, ever forget it.